Maybelline, why can't you be true?
Hello, it's Marshall Chess here again, continuing the story of my father, a guy named Chuck Berry, who was a blues fan of Muddy Waters, came to Chicago, went to see Muddy Waters at some funky bar, and went up to Muddy afterwards and said, "Look, I've made a tape. I want to be a blues singer too. I've got a band in St. Louis. What can I do?" Muddy says, "Tomorrow morning you go to Chess Records, you go ask for Leonard Chess and say Muddy Waters sent me." And he did. That was Maybelline, man, the first big crossover rock and roll hit for Chess Records. My father heard the original version, which was called Ida Red, sent Chuck back to rewrite it, and Chuck came back. Chuck really wanted to be a blues singer. The B side of Maybelline was a straight blues record called Wee Wee Hours. But when they heard the final version of Maybelline, they knew they had something different. It's a great rock and roll story. My dad got in his car. He was doing a road promotion trip. My uncle and my father took different areas of the country. New York City was my father's territory. He gets to New York. The number one radio station in New York was DJ'd by a disc jockey named Alan Freed. Alan Freed was the man who came up with the name rock and roll. My dad played Maybelline by Chuck Berry to Alan Freed, who said, "Man, this is a hit, but I want a piece of it in order for me to make it a hit." So my dad got on the phone with Chuck Berry. Chuck agreed, and the writer became Alan Freed on Maybelline. He'd make some money on every copy sold. My dad gets in his car the next day, gets to Cleveland, Ohio. He calls my uncle. My uncle says, "What's going on?" The phone hasn't stopped ringing about that Maybelline record. And it turned out that Alan Freed played the record all night, the only record he played over and over. And that's what we call it, broke the record. People wanted it. Record shops wanted it. And that was 1955. It was a big change. It was the first record that we had that really sold to white people. They call that a crossover record. Sells to black and to white.
Maybelline, why can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline, why can't you be true? You done started back doing the thing you used to do. A Cadillac pulled up the heart of the foe. Before got a hop and wouldn't do no more. The gun got a cloud and started to rain.
And ironically, that same year, in walks Bo Diddley for an audition. My uncle listened to that and said, "This is something different." Now we had Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry, our first two crossover records in 1955. It was a big year for me because that was my bar mitzvah. I'm Jewish. That's a big thing. When you're 13, you become a man. It's called the bar mitzvah. But we had these hits, and my dad we had these hits, and we had cash coming in for the first time. So my dad made my bar mitzvah a big celebration party of about 200 people. And it was like the cream of the record industry. The Erdigans were there. Sam Phillips from Sun Records were there. It was one of the first interracial affairs ever in Chicago. I have a book called Marshall's Bar Mitzvah book with all these pictures. It was a great event. The doo-wop group, the Flamingos, came by and did a number. It was a band there, and that was the beginning of it was the beginning of rock and roll and the expansion of Chess Records.
Won't you come to my house with black cat bones?
When Chess was started in 1950, our location was 4750 South Cottage Grove. It was a small building in the ghetto attached to a printing operation. In fact, it was funny. They would print papers for the mafia of Chicago and Detroit. And my father became friends with them. They ended up opening up a small record pressing plant. See, that was the big problem in those independent labels. The big majors owned all the big factories. If you had a hit, Chuck Berry, you needed 5,000 copies in a week. Sometimes you couldn't get them made. So my father always aware, we should have our own pressing plant. We should have our own studios. We can't be dependent on other people. So we had a small record pressing plant at 4750. And I could really remember because when I was 16, I hated it when I got my driving license. They told me that's the summer of my 16th birthday. I got my license in March. Starting in June, I had to go to that plant every morning at 6 a.m. till the foreman got there at 8. Because when they had hits, they'd run shifts all night. There was only about 10 presses. So I can really say I started my career. I pressed a few records, man. It was a table with a hot plate and these squares of black, and you would pick it up with your bare hands, man. You put it on this press, lift it up with two hands, push it down. Both hands had to push two buttons so you wouldn't get them caught, and out would come a 45 with a ragged edge. You'd put that on a piece of wood like a spindle while you set up the next one. While that was pressing, you trim the edge. Then you throw all those edges in a box. Later on, you grind up those edges to make more material. That's why chess records sounded noisy. We used that material over and over. Anyway, we had the plant at 4750. We were knocking out records for us and for other small labels who had hits and needed product. We wanted to expand. My dad knew he needed a studio. He borrowed money from my grandfather and built a new building, 2120 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which became the famous Chess Landmark Studios, where the Rolling Stones begged to record in 1964. Yours truly set that up. And our reward was one of their few instrumentals called 2120 South Michigan, on a Rolling Stones album, named after our address. Anyway, that studio was fantastic. We had a brilliant engineer named Jack Weiner who built a new kind of studio. It was called a floating studio built on strings. We had self-created echo chamber. If you want more info on 2120, check out a special podcast I've done on the channel. Even before Chuck and Bo in 55, my father and uncle saw they were beginning to develop record distribution, and they saw that there was a market for jazz. These same people who were buying blues led to other people who were buying jazz. So we decided to start a jazz label, which we did, called Argo Records. Argo was formed in 1952. We got very lucky because one of the first Argo jazz albums became one of the first big jazz album hits in America. Ahmad Jamal, But Not For Me. Ahmad Jamal at the Pershing was the name of the album. It became a big seller. Record distributors would drive to Chicago in their cars. This is before FedEx, UPS, all those ways. It would take days to get records. When you had a hit, these independent guys wanted it, They would drive to their cars to pick up albums so they could sell them that quick. It was a hot album. It had a hit track in it called Ponciana and another one called But Not For Me. And that was our first jazz album. Shortly after that, there was a lawsuit with an English spoken word label named Argo Records, and we were forced to change the name. Argo became the famed jazz label Cadet Records. On Cadet, we had some of the greatest jazz artists in America. We had Roland Kirk's first album, the guitarist Kenny Burrell, Ramsey Lewis, Ahmad Jamal, James Moody, Dorothy Ashby on jazz harp. More and more. I mean, we got as many great jazz artists as blues artists, and Cadet became an established, well-known label for jazz. One of the ways that Cadet was established with so many great musicians was that we brought in Jack Tracy. Jack Tracy was the editor of a jazz magazine called Downbeat, which happened to be published in Chicago. We made Jack the A&R producer. He knew every guy that was coming to town. Of course, they were doing stories on them. So he would go to all these artists and say, look, after your gig in Chicago, come by Chess Studios at midnight and earn some money. So, in a way, a lot of those Cadet albums were really true jazz. They were guys that just joined together. Some nights it was horrible, but some nights they melded together like true jazz and made great music. And there's some great, great Cadet jazz albums to this day that you can buy and hear online. But at the same time, doo-wop was happening. We immediately scored with the Flamingos, the Moonglows, two of the top doo-wop groups in America. What I'm getting at is that Chess as an independent label wasn't just a blues label. We were reaching out in every possible direction. We were probably the only full-service black music label in the world.
But these gospel songs, the good news of God. And many times in our singing, we sing what we call an old shout song. Some song wherein we can tell the people around us how the Lord.
Then we went to gospel. I mean, come on, Ralph Bass, who we got from King Records, we made him the gospel man. Right away, we were pulling in great groups, the Blind Boys of Mississippi, the Violinaires, Reverend C.L. Franklin. We put out sermons of Aretha Franklin's father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, on 78. And the whole South of America got their first taste of great religious stuff that's now on television. At first, it was on 78s, Chess 78s. I remember packing up The Eagle Flies on Friday. That meant you got paid on Friday because Eagle was on the money. I remember packing those up to ship them. The reason that could happen was in the South, where millions and millions of black people live.
Oh, promise my Lord that I was going through. Oh, yeah. Lord, I'll start.
In the South, there was one major radio station, WLAC, out of Nashville, Tennessee. That covered 50,000 watts. That covered all of the South at night. And they would play on Sunday mornings these sermons. So black people throughout the whole South heard these sermons by Reverend Franklin very much like they do now on television when they put it on Sunday morning. It was way ahead of its time. And we sold a lot of gospel albums combined with the jazz albums. We had the doo-wop, we had the blues, we had rock and roll. And then you had me, who wanted so much to be successful as a record producer, start Cadet Concept. As blues wound down, as the next generation of black people were born in the North, the ones who had left the South and migrated to all the big cities in America, their children thought blues was music of their parents and grandparents. They wanted new music. And at that time, that was the fertile ground for the birth of rhythm and blues. Motown exploded on the scene. Chess was desperate to continue with this new kind of music, and before long had a roster of great R&B and soul artists: Little Milton, Billy Stewart, Etta James, Fontella Bass, and many, many more.
Rescue me, or take me in your arms. Rescue me, I want your tender charm, 'cause I'm lonely and I'm blue.
I've told you the story of Chess from blues to gospel to jazz to doo-wop to R&B. The next chapter is going to be the psychedelic chapter. You'll hear from yours truly how he broke ground with this new market emerging in America. Hippies, marijuana, LSD. Hallelujah.
But I got everything, all in the good. I love you, baby. I love you, baby. But I got everything, all in the good.